Welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I read through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, The West Australian, and I criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First up, Dodging Dislikes, 26th of November 2014. Here's an idea for those who believe the ABC is biased. Don't watch or listen to it. I dislike the bias in Murdoch newspapers, so I don't buy them. Alan Stobie Hester. Here's the thing, Alan Stobie. There is a big difference between a publicly funded broadcaster like the ABC and a privately run newspaper like the Murdoch newspapers. I would agree that the right-wing newspapers, as run by News Corp and others, if they don't represent your views, don't read them. Vote with your feet and vote with your wallet, like every good capitalist. On the other hand, though, the ABC is a publicly funded broadcaster through our tax dollars, and it is explicitly, because it is run by the government, supposed to be representative of the people, the taxpayers, but the public in general. So the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, is similar somewhat to the BBC, but much smaller in scope and much less well-funded. And it is explicitly meant to represent the diversity of the Australian community and the particular Australian content, if you like. It's supposed to promote Australian content over overseas stuff. And it is always targeted as being left-wing. There's always this perception that it has a left-wing bias or a sort of progressive social agenda. The thing is, all of the objective studies that I could see where people have tried to quantify how biased it is to the left wing have come out with the finding that it is either neutral or slightly right wing, which is odd. So what I think is actually going on here is that the ABC is fairly centrist or right wing, or slightly right wing, as found by these analyses. But every other media organisation, newspapers, radio stations and TV stations here are further to the right of the ABC. And so because it is the most left-wing, even though it's actually in the centre between our contemporary political parties, it is seen as being more left-wing than it really is. This is similar to how in the US you can have the Democrats, who anybody outside of the US looks at and says, wow, they're sort of centre-right. In the US, they're seen as being, socialists and communists. That's simply because they are as left-wing as it gets in the US with any kind of sizable representation. And I think the same thing's happening with the ABC here. It's the only prominent media organisation that is even close to the left wing of the spectrum, and therefore it is seen as being more extremely left-wing. Now the other thing is that even if it was left-wing biased, I don't see that as being inherently too much of a problem, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the ABC, unlike all the commercial operations, has an explicit thing in their charter about attempting to be unbiased. Now, I don't think they succeed, because I don't think any media organisation can succeed in being unbiased. But I think they do a good job of trying to be. And to put this in perspective, if you think about the kinds of people who want to work for a public broadcaster, they are not representative of the general Australian population. What you overwhelmingly get is urbanised, middle-class, educated white people. These are the kinds of people who want to work for public broadcasting generally, much more so than kind of want to work in other organisations or other jobs. And so what you find in the ABC is that, generally speaking, the staff of the ABC are not as diverse, don't represent the full diversity of Australian culture to the same degree. They do tend to be urbanised, white, middle-class, educated people. And when you look at, so they do surveys of voting intentions, they skew very much to the Greens, who are very much a minor political party here, but they get almost half of the votes of Australian ABC staffers. That's how slanted their actual staff are. But when you look at the actual coverage that the Greens get on the TV and on the radio by the ABC, it's far, far less. In fact, it's much more in keeping with their overall community support. What this means is that the ABC is effectively countering its own bias. Not entirely, absolutely not entirely, but to a large extent. Because if people were just going with what they thought, you would see much more left-wing slant than what is currently on the ABC. And so, because the ABC has this commitment to be fair and balanced, and has this taxpayer oversight, and has this constant criticism of it, much more so than any of the private newspapers do, because it has all of that pressure, I think they actually do a very good job of counteracting a lot of their biases. I mean, it's not perfect, and it, could probably be improved, I guess. It certainly needs to be kept up. I don't think we should have a lessening of any of that. But they do seem to counter their bias much better than you might otherwise expect. The other reason I don't think the left-wing bias of the ABC, if it had one, would be such a huge issue, as long as it's a relatively minor bias, is because they need to represent the diversity of Australian culture in their community. And by that, I think actually one of the effective ways the ABC can do that is not to try and accurately represent all of the spectrum of Australian values, but rather to try and represent those people in Australia who are not represented in other media. So the right-wing viewpoint is very well publicised across AM radio in particular, newspapers, and some of the commercial channels. The left-wing viewpoint absolutely isn't. And so, in a way, to be a fair and balanced in the current media landscape, some left-wing bias actually would help, because it would allow some of these viewpoints that would otherwise not get any kind of coverage. And so if somebody were to take a sample of Australian media, a unbiased sample of Australian media would be slanted heavily to the right, because much of the media is right-wing slanted. And so a left-wing bias on the ABC, provided it's not too great, actually would be a good thing, because then it would give voice to the people who otherwise wouldn't have a voice. Next up, This Sorry Saga, 26th of November 2014. The calls for alteration of the Senate election process due to the whole Palmer United Party Jacqui Lambie saga are laughable. Blame it on the gerrymander. Letters 25th of the 11th. The real tragedy here is that we have thrown away the hard-fought original concept of strong state representation in the Senate. Instead, we line up and endorse the political party model like a conga line of battery hens. Mitchell, Jessen, Menorah. Okay, so there's several things in here that I don't have time to get into. Firstly, if you've not heard of Jacqui Lambie, she is one of these things that Australian politics throws up from time to time, who is really taking that mentality of politicians should be just like their electorate to extremes, and she is basically no better than the average, if not the worst, of her electorate. The other thing is, she is part of this whole Palmer United Party thing, which is essentially a vanity party created by a billionaire that he managed to buy himself 5 seats in at the last election. Since then, it's all blown up because you can't simply build a functioning, stable political party on the ego of one very rich man. Anyway, the point I want to get to, though, is this idea of state representation in the Senate. So here in Australia, unlike other places around the world, but when you have somebody elected to Parliament here, you basically can expect them to vote with their party every time. Crossing the floor and voting against your party is considered a very big deal here. Candidates are not expected to make free use of their sense of conscience. They are expected to toe the party line on almost everything. And consequently, we do feel very much like we are voting for a party rather than a person here. Now, not everybody feels that way, and people always complain that that's the way it is, but generally speaking, that's the way the political landscape works here. Is that, yes, you want to vote in an intelligent representative for your electorate, but not because they were going to stand up to their party, but rather they're going to work within their party to stand up for your interests, your electorate, and hopefully sway their political party to make better decisions. But very much they're expected to work within their party rather than against their party. And yes, the original idea of the Senate here, like across the world, particularly America, is that it would allow states to have better representation than their population would otherwise allow. So like in many other places, the lower house is built on population levels. So roughly speaking, each person is represented by the same value of vote. So states with smaller populations, like Western Australia, have less seats in the lower house, which means that generally, our interests are not well served by whoever's in charge of the lower house, which is generally the government. The government is generally swayed to the population centres like Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane. The upper house, on the other hand, like in America and many other places, is strictly the same. The same number of senators come from each of the states, and so each of the states is equally well represented in the upper house, which means that helps to counteract any tendency towards population centres. And so yes, the Senate was designed to try and produce strong states representation. So you couldn't just have rule by Canberra or Melbourne or Brisbane. They had to take into account everybody else's opinions as well. And that's not something that was particularly hard fought. This was a fairly common understanding about how you should structure parliamentary systems at about the time that Australia was federated and we got our own parliament, which was only just over 100 years ago now. It wasn't that long ago. These were not things that we fought hard against a sort of entrenched monarchy or whatever. Australia is quite a new country. Other places, they did have to fight much harder for this. And yes, we have lost some of that idea of that senators should be beholden to their state, because they are much more beholden to their political party, which means that they tend to go along with their political party, even if their political party is not in the best interest. The decisions a political party may come to, not necessarily in the best interest of their state. It has to be egregiously bad. But that said, I don't think the system is that broken, because I think overwhelmingly what we get is we get these senators working within their parliament, within their party, to sway their party to take into account the interests of the various states. I don't think we can come up with a system that's going to work any better, especially given that, broadly speaking, the same model of parliament here is in place around the world and in nations that are newer than ours. So even nations who've had to come up with ways of governing have looked around at the best systems we've come up with and basically come up with more or less the same systems we've got here. I think the best we can hope for is some tweaking to produce better balance. Fatality puts cricket at a crossroads, 28th of November 2014. Does anyone remember when cricket was a true sport? When fielders applauded a special innings by a rival batsman as he left the field? When batsmen walked when they knew they were out? And when they played simply for love of the game? There are only two reasons for a bouncer. First, to intimidate a batsman who cannot be dismissed with a standard ball, and, second, to cause an involuntary action that may result in a dismissal. Now that Cricket Australia has proof that such a ball could be fatal, will they consider action or wait for another fatality? G. Jackson, Inaloo. Okay, so for those of you who don't follow cricket or aren't Australian, one of our cricketers, sort of middle-tier Australian representative cricketers, so, elite sports people, was killed in a freak accident on the cricket pitch. Essentially, he was hit by a cricket ball that was bowled, hit him under the left ear, I think, caused some kind of brain injury that he subsequently died the next day. This has been the news here. It's sort of 6 or 7 pages in every newspaper, like every day for almost a week since he passed. This is the news. And this has been every story, every letter to the editor has been about this. And the thing is that it really misses the point that this was a freak accident. When we look at, I went looking for people who died playing cricket. We've had 3. 3 people, there was one that happened just afterwards as well. An umpire was killed. So 4 in about the last 15 years. And before then, either people weren't keeping track of it or there simply weren't any. I had to look back a very long time before that. So we're looking about 4 in the last sort of 15 to 16 years, or about 1 every 4 years. This is a very low rate given the amount of cricket that's played. This is on an international level. It's not just in Australia. This is internationally about 1 every 4 years. If you think about the sheer number, there's 1 billion people in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. These people are cricket mad. The amount of cricket that's being played in the subcontinent alone is huge. Cricket is one of the biggest sports in the world. It's probably second maybe to soccer in terms of the amount of people participating in it. And the numbers of people dying, or even flows down to injured, is very small compared to the benefits of people participating in sport. Now, at the elite level, it's all about entertainment. I understand that, and it's a business, and it's about selling people stuff, and it's about all the rest of it. Should we consider this as a workplace safety issue? Possibly. I think that's true. I think somebody, this guy, his job was to play cricket and he died on the job, as it were. And so his employers have a duty of care to him, and they obviously failed in this, and so I think we need to look into it. But basically, given the amount of protection he was wearing his helmet. In fact, actually, one of those 4 deaths was somebody who'd refused to wear a helmet and was struck in the head. Somebody who's refused their protective gear, I don't think should even particularly count. So maybe you should look at reviewing the safety gear. But basically, to think that cricket is a particularly dangerous sport is completely false. It just isn't. Particularly given how dangerous it could be. I mean, a cricket ball is incredibly hard. They are bowled at very high speeds. The fast bowlers will produce it at about 160 k's an hour or about 100 miles an hour, which is very fast for a ball that is at least as hard as a baseball. And so, yeah, getting hit in the head is potentially dangerous. It's amazing. The kind of protection that people must be getting from their helmets is large, because the number of deaths we had are very, very small. In fact, so of those 4 deaths, Phil Hughes is the only one I know of who died by being struck by a cricket ball in the head, who was wearing a helmet. Of the others, there are a couple of deaths. Well, there's one death from somebody being struck in the chest and having a heart attack. But literally there's only 1 or 2 of those deaths in the last 100 years that have been reported, and there have been no other strikes to the head killing somebody who was wearing a helmet. That tells me that cricket is much safer than we would like to think, and that this was just a freak accident that happens when you have a large number of people involving any sport. I mean, people die on the soccer pitch, probably at a higher rate than people die playing cricket. And I don't even have any particular love for cricket. Also, the other thing about this letter that pisses me off is it's totally going on about this golden age. There was no golden age of cricket where it was a true sport played by gentlemen simply out of the love of the game. There was no golden age. You might think back, well, surely, back in the day, that's how it was played. No, it wasn't. Right from the start, humanity has never produced a generation of true gentlemen who simply... That was always the picture of cricket. That's how they wanted to portray themselves. I mean, think about Bodyline. I mean, Bodyline was the English bowlers who'd learned that if you bowl the ball directly at the person so that they get injured if they don't play a particular thing, is you're much better at getting them out. In the 1970s, Australia produced a bowler, Jeff Thompson, who quite famously said in a TV interview that he quite liked injuring the batsmen, and he much preferred to see the blood on the pitch than to get them out. There has never been a golden age. People have always been like this. It's just that cricket has always wanted to portray itself as better than now, and has always appealed to some previous than now, to kind of evoke that image. And it's simply not true. It's always been thugs pretending to be gentlemen, just as rugby has. Saving an industry, 2nd December 2014. The United States, when their car industry was in trouble, mandated that all local, state and federal institutions that received federal funding must use the US-produced vehicles. If we'd followed their example, we could have saved our own car industry. Would it have been so much hardship for government servants to give up luxury cars and novated leases? Why Australia, with vast iron ore and coal reserves, is not an exporter of steel shows our government's short-sightedness. Michael Whitworth, Safety Bay. Now, I suspect there's a few other things going on here. Basically, with the United States, the situation was somewhat different. Our car manufacturers here were modern, efficient operations without huge debt burdens for things like pensions. The US, my understanding of it, I'm not an expert, was somewhat different. The car manufacturers there that were bogged down in really inefficient and bad sort of corporate structures. So it wasn't really about their ability to produce cars, it was about the way they were governed. And they had huge issues with unionised labour and huge debts to pensioned employees that they simply couldn't resolve. There was no way they could resolve these, or there seemingly was no way they could resolve them. And essentially they were going to have to go bankrupt. The federal government there took the view that if the car companies could come out, if essentially the manufacturing of cars could be separated from this terrible corporate arrangements and sort of the debt that they'd accumulated through bad management, the car manufacturing itself would be quite viable, as long as they could restructure. There was just no way to restructure it while still kind of continuing on as it was. They couldn't piecemeal restructure in the short term and continue manufacturing. So what was seen was essentially they were going to have to go bankrupt and rise from the ashes as new companies to some extent. And part of what that meant was there was going to be a period of time whereby car manufacturing was in serious trouble. And as a short-term solution, what made sense was to keep the US cars being bought. And of course, the federal government can really only make that happen efficiently by mandating it through institutions that receive their funding, mandating them buy US cars. The key point here is it was always going to be short term. The US auto industry is not, its sustainability is built on much more than just federal government mandated purchase of US cars. If that's all it was that was keeping it afloat, then that would have been a very, very stupid decision by the US government. Differently from that, here in Australia, our car industry wasn't like that. It was well run, well regulated, well managed, and had simply been receiving money from the government at a large rate for a large number of years, because we as a society had wanted to say that we were building Australian cars, built by Australians, for Australian conditions, which made some sense. The problem was that was unsustainable. Left to their own devices, these car companies weren't able to sustain Australian manufacturing of cars. It simply cost too much. It was cheaper to manufacture them elsewhere and ship them here. And eventually the government realised that even if they had done some kind of mandated thing like this where, yes, government buyers had to buy Australian-built cars, this was only ever just going to be an inefficient government subsidy for a car industry that was, by itself, unsustainable. Now, you might say, well, but isn't it worth, propping it up? Because should we? Well, yeah. The only reason you'd want to prop up this thing is the car industry is if you want to maintain Australia's manufacturing capabilities. That is, if you're afraid you're going to lose the kind of manufacturing skills if you no longer manufacture here. And we weren't in any danger of doing that. The Australian manufacturing sector has shrunk, but it's still there, and it's always going to be there. So there will still be manufacturing in Australia, not auto manufacturing, because that has to happen on a much larger scale that we can't support. But the actual techniques involved in manufacturing will still be kept here, because we'll still be doing some manufacturing. So there was no need to keep it afloat just simply to keep the knowledge here, and it costs us to keep it afloat for any other reason. It's better for the Australian economy to simply buy cheaper overseas cars, and then the money that we save by doing that, ploughing back into the economy in other ways. And that's precisely what the Australian government's done. Now, the manner and the timing in which they did that, sure. I mean, I'm not going to defend that as necessarily the best decision. I think it should have happened earlier, to be honest, and I think it should have been phased out over a longer period of time so that people who were in the manufacturing industry could have been transitioned out, because essentially our economy is shifting away from manufacturing. I mean, the bottom line is those jobs are inefficient, and the only way they were going to survive was being propped up by government subsidies, which is a waste of government money. And so essentially at some point these people were going to have to move from manufacturing into other areas of the economy if they wanted to keep their jobs, which presumably they do. They want to have a job. And I think the government should have done that over a longer period of time with clearer commitment. But Australian politics being as it is, nobody was willing to actually make that. So in the end it happened to be a short, sharp shock, which was, probably not the best scenario, but it is still better than throwing good money after bad. Last up, proof of the pudding. 2nd of December 2014. The fact that 81% of Year 10 students who sat a civics and citizenship test did not know the Queen was Australia's head of state simply means Australia is ready to become a republic. PJ Arathoon, Beachborough. I like this letter. I think the key thing here is that the reason that 80% of our Year 10 students did not know that the Queen is actually our head of state, really what that tells us is that who our head of state is plays no big role in everyday life. It actually plays no big role in political life here. Most people probably don't quite understand that the Queen is our head of state because it makes no real difference. The Queen has been our head of state in name only for a long time now. Her representative here in Australia, the Governor-General, the last time they did anything of any particular note was back in the 70s, and that was of particular major note. But since then, at least the last 40 years, really the highest political power in the land has been the Prime Minister. And so everything above that has really just been ceremonial and figurehead type stuff. And I think we could, if it weren't for people's, particularly Australians' reluctance to change, I think we could easily transition to being a republic, sooner rather than later. And it's heartening that people aren't being made to learn stuff which is largely irrelevant. I mean, there's so many other things that people need to learn these days. It seems to me a waste of time to try and force them to learn things that aren't actually relevant to their lives. If they want to know who our head of state is, today's generation, today's year 10s, could find that out rather easily. You simply have to ask Siri. Anyway, that's it for this week. I hope you're all doing well, and I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See ya.